Thank you, Chris. So as Chris had mentioned, we'll start off with deer. So the type of deer that we're probably most common with or most familiar with here in Illinois is white-tailed deer, which are native residents to our forests and fields here in Illinois. And in the past few years, we have been noticing that the populations of these deer have increased, and we're noticing them more and more. But this increase can be largely attributed to one thing, expansion of human population into rural areas. So we're moving into their habitats. And then it's also a case of deer have been able to adapt to coexisting with us moving into their habitats. And so when we plant things in our yard that are tasty to these deer, it's something for them to easily adapt to us moving into their area. It also has to do a lot with a lack of natural predators and an abundance of food and gardens and ornamental landscapes. So that's oftentimes why we can perceive deer as a nuisance in our landscapes. So with deer in our landscape, deer will feed on plants pretty much any time of the year, but most of the damage that we do notice with deer occurs in the fall, winter, and early spring when their food sources are somewhat limited. So they're browsing into our yards looking for a food source. Deer browsing can be easily distinguished from any damage that would be caused by rabbits, woodchucks, or squirrels. So with deer, they lack an upper incisor, so they gnaw vegetation when browsing. And with that, it leaves ragged ends on anything that they're feeding on. So in this picture here, you can see some leafy greens that have been fed on. And then they also, during like their rut season, they will rub their antlers up against trees, which you can see done here. And so that can be an issue that we have with deer in the landscape as well. Deer are creatures of habit, so once they've established a feeding area, it is difficult to get them to leave. And so it's important that we are implementing preventative measures before deer get into the habit of visiting our yard and gardens. So there are lots of options that we can do to protect our plants from deer damage. And some of those things include exclusion, so keeping them away from our plants. Some different things that we can do include setting up barriers between deer and the plants to be protective. So this is an effective way of keeping the deer from our plants. For individual plants or a small group of ornamental plants, we can do anything from placing cages around the plant, or we can even use chicken wire or fencing around the plants. So there's many different options that are shown here. If you look down here in your bottom right-hand corner, they have used chicken wire and set up like a hoop system or a half hoop system to be able to cover the plants to keep not only is this going to keep deer out, but it could potentially keep out rabbits or any other mammals or animals that you might have as issues in your yard as well. There's other types of things that we can use as well, including netting. So they again have set up kind of a hoop system and laid the netting over top of it. And so that helps to protect what looks like some strawberries. Burlap is also another good option. So here in this plant, they've wrapped the plants in burlap during the winter, and they are protecting the plant that way. Here with this plant here, they've just wrapped fencing around it. So they've set up some T-posts, and that helps to support the fencing, but keeps animals from eating, specifically deer, from eating that plant. Obviously with deer, we know that they are able to jump fairly high, so they're capable of jumping up to 10 feet high. So when we're thinking about something like fence, we need it to at least be 8 feet. Otherwise, they can easily get over that. And so Over here in this bottom left-hand picture, you can see that they probably have invested quite a bit into this structure to build a nice fence around their garden to keep any wildlife out. Electric fence is also a good option for providing exclusion to areas. And so with electric fence, obviously this one, you can see that they've put multiple lines in to keep the deer out. But typically with electric fence, you can get away with just a couple of lines, with the lower line being placed 10 to 12 inches above the ground. And then the top wire has to be about 36 inches above ground. Obviously, you would find out quickly if this is unsuccessful, because if you're seeing damage from deer, you can move that line up if they're able to get over it. So this is a control method that Chris implemented at their extension office in Macomb. And so they were having some issues with deer. And what they used for exclusion was they used T-posts that they had set up at different angles. You can see here in this picture, they've kind of set them up so they can keep the deer out. But in the picture on the right, you can see that it was unsuccessful. So something like that, it looks like probably the deer just came in and pushed the T-post to the side and kept on their merry way with feeding. And so not every practice is successful. So it's kind of a trial and error thing. If you try something and it doesn't work, sometimes we have to go back to the drawing board and figure out a new method to be able to keep them out and keep our plants from being damaged. So another way of preventing deer damage is through the use of repellents. Since deer rely heavily on smell and taste to find their food, repellents can be effective in keeping them from the yard and garden. The key to using repellents is it's important to start early in the fall before, again, the deer start to establish their home range and their feeding areas. So as I had mentioned previously, they are creatures of habit. And so if we start using repellents too late, they've already established that area, or they've already found those tasty plants in your yard, and they're going to want to come back for more. One downside to repellents is they must be reapplied regularly throughout the winter and spring. So if you think about anytime that it snows, anytime that we get a rainfall event, that repellent is being washed away, and so it's no longer effective. Unfortunately, when food sources are scarce, such as midwinter, and when deer energy reserves are lowest, repellents often will not keep deer from feeding on landscape plants, because it's kind of that point of desperation where they need something to eat. And so they'll do whatever they have to do to get that. And then another tactic is using scare devices. So we're all familiar with scarecrows. That was one thing that was suggested to use when preventing deer in our landscapes. One thing with scare devices is if it's something that is not moved, or if it's not something out of the ordinary, it's not going to be effective to the deer, because deer will get used to it. There are a lot of commercially available products that are designed to scare deer, and some of those include scarecrows, lights, whistles, water jets, and devices that make loud noises. Some people will also use radios to help to deter deer, but like I said, they will quickly get used to it. So if you're not moving your water jet, or if you're not moving those lights frequently, they'll get used to it and it'll no longer scare them. So this is not always the most effective tactic either. So then our final resort when it comes to preventing deer damage is through the use of plant selection. So some plants are more tasty to deer than other plants. And by planting plants that are not the tastiest plants, we can prevent some of that damage that's being done. So these plants are some plants that are rarely damaged by deer. I'm sure you can probably, if you know anything about these plants, you can probably guess why maybe they're not the most um, desired plants by deer. So one of them being common barberry. A lot of times they have spines, and so I can't imagine that would be anything that would be too enjoyable to feed on. American holly is another good option. In previous webinars of this webinar series, Ken told us a little bit about growing American holly. So if that's something that you're interested in, and you also have issues with deer, you can visit that webinar and get some information on American holly and growing it. Some other options, so these are plants that are seldom severely damaged. So there is the potential that they can be damaged, but they're not quite as commonly damaged. So two of those are forsythia and common lilac. So they're still pretty in our landscape and something nice to look at, but they also are not as likely to be damaged by deer. Some other ones include dogwoods, and you can find that list to the left side of the slide. These are some plants that are occasionally severely damaged. So these are ones that deer are going to enjoy feeding on more often. You can see there's a lot of maples on here. So if you have a heavy deer presence in your lawn, maybe these are some that you would not plant. And then lastly, these are the plants that are frequently severely damaged. So if you had deer feeding in your yard, these are some that we often see feeding on. And these make complete sense because something like hostas and tulips, they're a nice fleshy green. And I can't imagine if I were someone or an animal that enjoyed eating that type of thing, these would be very, very tasty. So something like hostas, that's something that's even been suggested for humans to eat. It's probably something fairly close to like lettuce. And so these plants are commonly seen to be fed on, and they can be severely damaged. So if it's something where you have a lot of issues with deer, maybe these are some things that you know to go ahead and protect each year, so that way you don't have a lot of damage to them, or you can even just take them out of your landscaping and find something else to plant.
Well, we're going to be talking about raccoons and rabbits and a few other kinds of pests that you may find around your landscaping. So in general, whenever we're preventing wildlife damage, we need to assess the damage. And so as Katie mentioned, the deer can partake in particular vegetation and leave those ragged edges. And that's a pretty good sign that it is a deer that's causing that damage. But there may be other forms of damage that you might find from other animals. So it's important to identify and monitor for those pests. You could even put out a trail camera and be able to capture them as they move throughout your landscape. And prevention is the first line of defense. And so, as Katie mentioned, uh, not everything is a perfect scenario. And so, especially with deer, you need to try to get your protective measures up ahead of time so that they don't get used to that area and maintain that exclusion. The more familiar they become with an area, that can have a negative effect. And we can use scare tactics to temporarily keep out some animals. You need to evaluate how effectively your management strategies are working and do the best you can to prevent damage. So for exclusion, inspecting the fence, you may just have a general fence, chain link fence around your yard, but this particular fence isn't secured to the bottom wire, and so mammals can make their way under the fence and uh, travel back and forth into your landscape. So you also may need a smaller size depending on the pest. Rabbits can make it through a very small hole, as well as your squirrels and chipmunks and other uh, pests that you might find. Now, exclusion is a great tool for excluding pests. There's a number of pests that you want to protect, especially the bottom portion of the plant. Trees can be protected by cylinders or barriers, but as you see, this particular barrier wasn't surrounding the entire plant of this tree, this fruit tree. So your cylinder should be at least 18 to 24 inches high. You also need to account for any snow that may occur, as that lessens the amount of protection that you have for your particular plant. We'll talk about the eastern cottontail rabbit. This is found to a great distribution of Illinois. There's also a swamp rabbit that's found in the southern portions of Illinois. So rabbits, they like to have cover because they do have a lot of predators, whether it be hawks or owls or foxes. And so modifying their habitat, you can remove brush piles, clear out those weed patches, avoid any stone piles or other debris. And so keeping an open area allows for those predators to be able to find those rabbits a little more quickly. And also keeping your grass short can be an advantage to, uh, keeping the population in check for the rabbit. So protecting the vegetation, usually for rabbits, you can use a protection of a 1/4 inch mesh hardware cloth, and you want to set that firmly in the ground, and you can protect individual plants, as you see on the photo on the left. And for rabbits, the cottontail rabbit, they have a clean cut vegetation. So the bites that they take with their incisors, they're going to leave a clean cut with usually a 45-degree angle. But they also, besides herbaceous plants, can often choose the bark of some woody plants, especially the younger woody plants, and they may girdle those plants and those stems if they are not excluded from those rabbits. And so rabbits, they do repopulate. Just one female cottontail can have up to 20 to 25 young per year. And so these adorable little bunnies, they may find the way into your heart. They usually don't need a lethal control for rabbits, but as you see, they can repopulate quite quickly. And dried blood meal sometimes can be used to protect flower beds, but this also can be an attractant for dogs. There are a number of repellents that are available. Usually they work by odor, and so there are a few of them, not to differentiate between any particulars as far as one being better than the other, but there are some called hinder, impede, plant skid, and in some research, plant skid seemed to fare better as one of the protective measures. Okay, we'll cover raccoon. Now, an average adult male weighs between 15 to 20 pounds, and it was interesting that the northern Illinois raccoons tend to be larger than the southern Illinois counterparts. So they have these distinctive colorations of a mask across their face. As you see here, they do climb trees and are well adapted to climbing. They're a particular nuisance for those that grow sweet corn. So habitat modification, they can find their way into your home, whether it be through the roof or, protecting from those chimney caps. Make sure that they're fully secure. You don't want to leave pet food outside overnight. You want to make sure that your garbage cans are secure. usually a metal or a heavy-duty plastic container. Make sure that your garbage lids are closed. But one thing that they do, besides sweet corn, the lawn can be a problem because the grub populations, if they get to be significant, you may have raccoons that dig up and eat those grubs. So controlling the grub population can help to control those raccoons. Another method of control that works well is the electric fence, and that can work on a number of the animals that can be a pest. Another animal that does similar damage to the turf because of those grubs is the skunk. And so you need to be wary of the scent and odor that they do secrete whenever they are frightened. But there is a possibility that you may be able to trap animals, and usually there are often wire caged traps that can work for a number of these animals, but a wood box trap usually works better for the rabbits. They tend to go into those wooden boxes a lot more easier than for the wire caged version. And the Canadian goose, if you have some property that's next to water, it's much easier to prevent geese from using an area than from discouraging them after they've already been established. So these, again, can be another nuisance that you might find, especially if you have an area of water nearby.
So next we will talk about squirrels. So here in Illinois, we have 4 different species of squirrels that are native to the state. So first off, we've got the fox squirrel, and this is going to be the largest squirrel that is native to here in Illinois. They can weigh up to about 2 pounds, can be about 22 inches long on kind of the large end there. Their fur is kind of a rusty yellow with a black in it, and so they kind of have a kind of a reddish tinge to it a lot of times, and you can see in this picture. The ears, the belly, edge of tail is going to be lighter color, kind of a reddish orangish color for them. They tend to like open forest stands without a lot of understory, not a lot of growth on the ground there. That's kind of their preferred habitat. And with these, we'll often see them foraging on the ground, even a couple hundred meters, several hundred feet away from tree stands and stuff. So they're a little more comfortable on the ground compared to some of the other squirrels we may have. And they'll also kind of occupy that forest edge habitat in the kind of their native settings. And if you live in town, you're aware that we will get fox squirrels. They will readily live in suburban and urban settings as well. When we talk about invasive species a lot, we talk about the invasive species we get here in the United States and Illinois. Fox squirrels and some of our other squirrels that are native to North America are considered an invasive species in Europe, particularly the fox squirrels, where they are pushing out native species. So just kind of a somewhat interesting aside there that we have sent these around the world where they are considered invasive species and are kind of displacing native squirrels in other countries. Next squirrel we've got here in Illinois is going to be the eastern gray squirrel, and these are going to be the second largest squirrels. They can be about a pound and a half on the large side, about 17 to 18 inches long. They have gray fur on the back, and then on the belly end is going to be more of a white color. So it's probably the easiest way to tell fox squirrel and gray squirrel apart. They commonly confuse is look at the belly. If it's white, more than likely it's going to be a gray squirrel there. There can also be some color variants for eastern gray squirrel. You can also find black and white squirrels for eastern gray squirrels. They tend to like mature, dense forested areas, so larger kind of forested settings than maybe fox squirrels and some of these others. Typically, they're going to be like 100 acres or so in their natural settings, but again, they will readily live in urban and suburban areas. In the wild, they kind of prefer forests that have a lot of nut trees, so oak, hickory, hardwood forests are kind of their preferred habitat. These are some of the examples of some of the kind of the color morphs you can have with eastern gray squirrels. So we have the melanistic or the black on the left there, the leucistic and albinistic. So the leucistic is going to be on the bottom. They have black eyes, where Albino squirrels are going to have red eyes. That's on the top there. If you live in Fisher or Gibson City area, apparently there are a lot of this black color morph in those areas. And Olney and northeastern Illinois tend to have more of the white colored compared to the rest of the state. So some of these different colored morphs are a little more prevalent in different pockets of the state. We also have red squirrels here in Illinois. So these are going to be even smaller than the fox and gray squirrels, about 2/5 of a pound, about 11 to 13 inches long. And they have a little more reddish fur compared to the others. And they also have a white belly. And during the winter, oftentimes they'll have tufts on their ears. So you can kind of see this on this picture on this slide here, little tufts of hair on the tops of their ears. And they are most common in northeastern Illinois. If you look at the range maps, it's kind of all throughout Illinois, the range maps show, but typically they're going to be most commonly seen in northeastern Illinois. Can be found in a wide variety of different forests. These go all the way up into Canada, so a lot of times they're found in more coniferous forests the further north they go, but they can also be found in hardwood forests. And they'll feed on, our deciduous tree nuts, and also feed on pine nuts, pine cones, stuff like that. And they'll also feed on fungus in parts of their range too, including some of the fungus that would be toxic to humans. And then in Illinois, we also have the southern flying squirrel. So this is going to be the smallest squirrel species that is native to Illinois. They're about two ounces, about 8 to 9 inches long, so fairly small. They look larger because they have kind of the fold of skin on either side of their body. So you can see it on the bottom picture there, so that when they spread out their limbs, it helps them glide. So these flaps of skin make them look larger than they really are. Gray to brown fur on the back, and then again, a white belly. They tend to have, the eyes are kind of large and their tails are more flattened compared to the other squirrel species we have here in Illinois. And they are nocturnal compared to our other squirrel species, which are going to be more active. They're going to be active during the day, maybe a little bit into the evening and early morning, but flying squirrels are going to be nocturnal. Typically, or most commonly, they kind of prefer beech, maple, oak, hickory, and poplar forests. And we can find them throughout Illinois, but they are most commonly found in the southern part of the state. And they also tend to kind of live in areas that they're fairly close to a body of water. It's kind of their preferred habitat as well. So when it comes to nesting, this is kind of when we start, one of the ways we can get into, have some issues with squirrels in our landscapes and in our homes is with nesting. So squirrels kind of, in general, they build two different types of nests. They will build leaf nests, or nests made out of leaves and twigs and other kind of natural items like that. In the forks of trees, these are called drays. Those are those pictures there. Pretty easy to see this time of year with no leaves on the trees. And they will also nest in tree cavities, or a lot of times they'll be called tree dens. As a general rule of thumb, they're going to use those tree drays, those leaf nests during the warmer parts of the year. And then during the winter, and when they have babies, they tend to prefer to be in those tree dens, but they can't spend the entire year in those tree drays if there aren't suitable tree cavities available for nesting. And then if it's also possible, they can move into your attic. If you've ever had the mispleasure of having that happen, that is not something fun that you want to have. So you can see here, they can cause substantial damage to property, especially if they start chewing into siding, or if you have any openings that kind of go into the attic. They can chew on those to enlarge those so they can get into the attic. Once they're in there, they can cause more damage by chewing up insulation, chewing on electrical wiring. So just kind of compound those problems. So the picture on the left is an example of that. On the right, we've got a picture of some tubing and a car engine that they've chewed onto, so they can get in there and chew on stuff, especially if cars have sat for an extended period of time. They can cause issues with that as well. So kind of the big thing, especially for getting into attics and stuff like that, is going to be exclusion for that. And kind of a more natural setting, the damage, they can be feeding on bird seeds. So if you're not wanting to attract squirrels to your bird feeder, obviously they'd be a pest. sometimes they can start chewing on the wood and damage those. You can get into issues with like the squirrel on the right here chewing on branches and stuff. To get to sap, you see this a lot in sugar maples. If food is scarce during the winter, they may start feeding on the bark. And in extreme cases, they can girdle branches and stuff if they do enough feeding. Typically not too big of an issue though. So when it comes to preventing damage from squirrels on buildings, again, habitat modification is going to be important. Squirrels in general can jump about 10 feet, so you need to make sure you have trees, tree branches trimmed back at least 10 feet from buildings so they can't jump from the tree onto your roof or onto the building and stuff. Make it a little more difficult for them to get in there. If you've had issues with squirrels getting into an attic, you want to check buildings regularly. If you see any holes that they've chewed or they're starting to enlarge, you want to repair those, but you want to make sure you're not capturing those squirrels in the attic. So stuff some newspaper or something like that into those holes. Leave it for 2 or 3 days. If that paper hasn't been removed, more than likely the squirrels are not in the attic, and it's safe to patch that up if the paper's been removed. Then keep doing that until they're out of there, or you may need to use some kind of frightening device, a light, a strobe light, or radio, something like that to drive them out of that attic, so you can then patch up those holes and exclude them from your attic. If you do have to go to the removal route, they are a kind of a protected species in Illinois, so you do need a permit from a district wildlife biologist with the Illinois Department of Natural Resources in order to legally trap them in the state. So make sure you're doing that, or if you're having a company do that, make sure they have the proper permits and stuff to be doing that. When it comes to bird feeders, there's some other things we can do to try to prevent them from getting into our feeding on our bird food. Habitat modifications, so you can provide an alternate food source away from those bird feeders. So a pile of corn, maybe further back in the backyard, away from those bird feeders, kind of try to get them to go to that instead of the bird seed. You can try exclusion, so squirrel baffles, kind of those upside down cones on posts and stuff so they can't climb up them. Isolating those bird feeders away from trees or other things they may be climbing on, so they can't jump onto them will help too. There are a lot of squirrel-proof bird feeders out there, including this one in the picture there. Some of them work better than others. Squirrels can be rather determined. A lot of times they will eventually find a way in, so it may slow them down, but eventually there's a good chance they will find their way into the squirrel-proof type ones. There are also repellents that can be used, so you can treat bird seed with capsaicin. Sometimes you can get stuff with red pepper flakes and stuff like that in there. The capsaicin that you get from the red peppers, that gives the heat to hot peppers. That will affect squirrels, but does not affect birds. So you mix that in there, that spiciness will deter them from feeding on it, but won't do anything to the birds. Like Andrew mentioned, there's also repellents that could be used on buildings and stuff if they're chewing on those, or on trees potentially, if they're doing a lot of chewing on trees as well.
And now we're going to dive into the teeniest of the tiniest of the pests for today. And like what Ken had mentioned with squirrels, I think for the most part, everything that we have seen so far have been protected by law. So you do need permits for these. But what we're going to talk about here, the voles and mice, you do not necessarily need a permit for these guys. And so let's dive right in to voles. Now, when I say voles, I'm saying vole with a V. I feel like so often moles with an M are often accused as being the culprit of some damage that happens in the landscape. I often find, though, that moles with an M tend to be a bit more beneficial to our yards, at least from the standpoint of aerating my soil. But voles with a V, they can be downright destructive. And there are several species of voles that are found in Illinois. For the most part, we will be dealing with like the prairie vole and the meadow vole. And those are the primary species that we'll be dealing with. And then some of the ways how we tell the difference between a vole and a mouse because they look almost exactly like a mouse. Well, a vole, they're a bit more stockier. They have a bit more of kind of a bulk to them. They're anywhere from 4 to 7 inches in length, and they weigh up to 50 grams. So, I mean, again, very much mouse-like, but I would say the key distinction between a vole and a mouse is their tail. They have a very short tail. Oftentimes it's like the length of maybe an inch, half inch. Oftentimes what I found is that the literature compares the length of their tail to like their hind leg. It's about the same length as their hind leg. But so that is the key distinction that I have found. And when I find, say, voles out in the yard, and here in this image here, you can see that very small tail there on that rodent, and just that stocky nature of the vole. You know, he looks pretty fat and happy there with his cute little tail. Now, voles, like a lot of the other critters we've talked about today, can be very prolific. They can have several litters per year, and the size of the litter does vary by species. So our prairie and meadow voles, they can have up to 3 to 5 within a single litter. Woodland voles, they can have up to 2 to 3. And if you're wondering, where do these voles inhabit? Well, their name seems to indicate that. Prairie voles, obviously more of an open kind of prairie agriculture setting. Meadow voles, similar, but maybe getting a little bit more forested. And then woodland voles, of course, typically are found in the wooded areas. These guys have a very short lifespan, often less than 1 year. And this is really because they are a very important food source for other predators. So even though we don't necessarily like seeing them in the landscape and they do cause a lot of damage, they do serve a very important role. We don't necessarily want to say, hey, we just eliminate voles entirely. That would not be good for our ecosystem. But even if they do some good in the food chain, they also can do some bad in the landscape. So I do recall having a fruit tree grower. They were just starting out up in Warren County, Illinois, and they gave me a call after the spring, and their fruit trees looked like the tree there on the left side of that screen. You know, they had probably a half acre of fruit trees that had been completely chewed on. The base of that tree. They had removed all the trunk and all the tissue behind that trunk, and they had feasted on that as it was covered in snow. And they used that snow as cover so that no predators like hawks and things could go after them. Completely decimated this startup a tree fruit orchard. So lesson learned, right? So that is one major thing, is they can attack our younger trees or our trees that have very thin bark, things like our maples and such. And they'll eat a lot of other plants too. Not only will they go after trees, but you know, if tulips and a lot of the things that the deer will eat, the voles will eat as well. And the picture here on the right side of the screen, this is very common, a sight after the snow melts away and we reveal the runways that the voles have created underneath the snow. They will actually chew on the grass right there, create those runways. Now, while it may look really nasty and ugly, very often once that grass starts growing again in the spring, it often can flush with that green growth and fill those spaces in easily. Now, what can we do to control these little critters? Well, I think if you've heard a theme today, it is physical exclusion. The thing, sometimes we would say the most assured way is to keep them away from whatever target that they're going after. And so here you can see these tree colors have been employed to prevent voles from eating on there, also rabbits. It can prevent deer from rubbing on there. And so there's a lot of reasons to invest in something like a trunk collar or trunk protection, especially if you have a young tree, and especially, say, if you want to grow a couple tree fruit in your backyard. When it comes to trapping, that is definitely another possibility out there. Let's see. This is a situation right here taken by a colleague of ours, Richard Henschel. So after the snow melted up in where he's at, located in the collar counties of Cook County, these vole runways. Now, where do you think the voles are here? Well, if I follow these pathways back, they're probably residing in this denser grassy vegetation here in the background. That's probably where they're living. And then they emerge from there and they go out and they search for food. If I wanted to do something like a trap, you might consider something. This is my multi-catch trap. And we'll see a video about this here in just a second. But with this multi-catch trap, you basically wind it up, you set it by the runway, by where that entrance is to their home. You can bait it with some bird seed, and then they will walk through that little hole there, and it will flip them in the holding area. So it is a live trap. There are methods to dispatch them, as we want to do that humanely as best we can. And so follow the trap instructions for how to dispatch those animals humanely, and don't necessarily leave them outside so they can die of exposure, because that is not a humane way to go. Also encourage natural predators. Voles, they're not like the worst disease carrying animal, but they certainly can potentially be vectors of disease. And as we get into mice, you'll definitely see that. But think about snakes. Snakes don't carry human diseases. I mean, maybe venom, but that's rare. Maybe if you live in Southern Illinois, that could be more of a commonplace, but definitely not where I'm at, and other folks in the northern parts of the state. So you can encourage natural predation. You can install hawk roosts, where the large posts where hawks and owls can sit and monitor and help you out. Put pieces of tin down in the landscape where snakes would want to inhabit. So encouraging that natural predation, that can help keep things in check. We used to have voles in our high tunnel here at the extension office. And once we had a really bad year, they really went after our sweet potatoes. But then that next year, the voles were gone. Every time I walked in the high tunnel, I encountered a snake. And that was fine. All you got to do is stomp your feet really hard. They hear you and they go away. So, and then habitat modification. Again, as you can see in this image on the right side of the screen, where do they like to live? In that tall, brushy, scrubby area right there. So, clean some of that up, reduces that area for them where they would want to live. Now let's cover mice just real briefly here. And aren't they cute? But cute they are, but we don't necessarily want them in our house. And there are actually 6 species of mice that are native to Illinois. But keep in mind, the house mouse, which is probably the one that we will mostly encounter in our home, it is not native to Illinois. But we do have some native ones, and they also, just like the vole, serve a very important role in the food web. Many predators rely on mouse populations as their primary food source. And so pictured here on the left side of the screen, we have the house mouse. Now they're characterized as more of a sometimes grayish. This one pictured here is a bit more brownish in color, but more of a grayish mouse. The deer mouse here in the middle screen, they're a little bit smaller. Their ears are almost kind of hairless, and they have kind of that white underside. On the right, and the deer mouse is more kind of open ag, prairie, meadowlands. White-footed mouse, now that's more of a woodland type species. The deer mouse and white-footed mouse, they don't necessarily, I mean, you can find them in the same places, but their habitats don't necessarily overlap with each other. White-footed mouse and deer mouse are pretty similar in appearance. Both of them have very similar characteristics. And the problem with mice is that they, like the deer, have adapted very well to us humans. And where there are humans, there undoubtedly are mice. And mice can carry human pathogens. Wild mice in this part of the country are known to carry hantavirus or hantavirus. The house mouse is not believed to carry this disease, however. Now, this is an important thing. There are other diseases that pathogens, these rodents can carry. Hantavirus, one of those that there's a lot of information and there's a lot of cause for concern. And one of the ways to deal with something like mouse droppings, if they get in the house, is that you never clean up mouse droppings dry. You spray them down with bleach or Lysol. You use some type of a wet cleaning system so that that dust that gets created doesn't blow up and you don't inhale that, because hantavirus can be inhaled and you can get infected with that. So making sure you're always using some type of a kind of a wet cleaning system. It could be a wet rag or sponge or spritzing down, but never vacuum dry mouse droppings. And mice get into food. I mean, we've all probably had a mouse in the house, and oftentimes they are usually there, but we usually know them when they get into the pantry and they get into those food stores. In the landscape, mice can also cause damage to plants. We don't necessarily think of it like that, but they do. They do very similar damage that voles will do. and they can be a nuisance to some garden crops. And so they can be a nuisance, but very often when we encounter these guys, it is in the house. So what are some control options? Well, in the house, the best thing, of course, is going to be physical exclusion, is building them out. And that is the lingo speak here, making sure that they cannot get in from either the roof or from underneath siding and the various openings, because they can squeeze through very narrow openings. Anything that is larger than a 1/4 inch should be sealed. So you should be using, if you're trying to protect plants or anything like that, it should be a 1/4 inch hardware cloth mesh. That way you can make sure that they're staying and they can't squeeze through there. And you bury that bottom of that mesh a little bit in the soil. Baited traps. That is probably one of in terms of physical exclusion, next would be baited traps. And so pictured here on the left side of the screen, this is a snap trap. The simple wooden snap trap works fantastically. This is my baited snap trap here. And I like the plastic because I can, well, it's dirty now, but I can clean and sterilize it every time I catch a mouse in there, and they are fairly easy to set and they're reusable. You would just bait, there's a little cup in here that you bait with peanut butter, or even you could tie a piece of bacon to this platform here. One thing that folks might ask, and they say, well, the mouse keeps either stealing the food from the trap, or they're able to get they're avoiding the trap altogether. One thing that you could try is actually baiting the trap without setting the trap. This gets them comfortable with the mechanism, and they might be a little less cautious next time they come around to try to take the food, and you can set the trap at that point in time. Now, there are also poison baits that you can use out there. And so for the most part, a lot of like commercial vegetable growers, they have to keep mice and other rodents out of their sheds that they clean vegetables and things like that. So they might have to use some type of a bait station or a trap station. Recommendation goes though, poison bait only to supplement physical exclusion and trapping. If those aren't working, then you could turn to poison bait, making sure that you're reading those label directions and you're protecting that bait from being accessed by non-target animals, cats, dogs, kids, and the occasional stray human, one of us adults here. So I tend to not recommend poison baits because I've used poison baits in the past. Now, what happens when a mouse eats a poison bait? Well, it leaves somewhere and dies in your wall. There's nothing, you would never think that something so small could smell so bad, but it is certainly the case. And there's not much you can do about that unless you're willing to pull out your drywall and fish out the dead mouse from your walls. This video here, because we cannot repost this video on the recording. If you're watching the recording, we will include a link to it below. But just know, excuse me, this is one of my favorite wildlife specialists. This is Dennis Ferrero. He is a wildlife specialist with University of Nebraska Extension, and he's going to talk to us about mice and voles and a little bit about moles too. This is our final winter webinar of the series here, so hopefully you enjoyed it. Of course, you can always check us out on our blog. You can find that at go.illinois.edu/goodgrowing. We do a weekly podcast as well. We talked about CSAs this week, and so that will be an exciting one. It will be posted on Friday of this week. So again, go.illinois.edu/goodgrowing podcasts. We really enjoyed this last session here, the entire series that we did this winter. If you would like to give us feedback on wildlife and tell us, what you would like to know more about, please feel free. You can check out our online evaluation, whether you want to use the QR code here on the right, or just go to go.illinois.edu/GGWildlife, and you will find the evaluation there. Now, I can pop that link back up, but I do also want to make sure to give recognition to all of our presenters today. And here is our contact information if you have any additional questions that we can help with after today's webinar.